everybody, my name's Tracy. Welcome to Grown Up Storytime. I'm here in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Wtih. And today I'm going to read you a short story by Patricia Highsmith. Now, Patricia Highsmith had a career that spanned almost 5 decades, and she wrote a lot, mainly in the genre of psychological thriller and crime. Some of her more notable works are Strangers on a Train. That was her first novel, and Alfred Hitchcock made that into a movie. She also wrote a series known as The Ripleyad, which features the character Tom Ripley and includes in the novel The Talented Mr. Ripley. But as I said, I'm not going to read you any of her novels. I'm going to read you a short story. I'm reading it from the Selected Stories of Patricia Highsmith, which was published in 2001 by W.W. Norton. It's a collection of collections of short stories. And the story I'm going to read to you was originally published in 1975 in a collection called The Animal Lover's Book of Beastly Murder, which is a great title and an even greater collection because the characters in this collection are all animals, and it's told from the perspective of animals. So yes, stories of revenge and murder seen through the eyes of your family pet. So the story that I'm going to read is called There I Was Stuck with Busby, and the character in this is an old dog named the Baron. And the Baron is lamenting the death of his recently deceased master, as he calls him, Eddie, and he's really not very happy with this current living situation. So without further introduction, here is There I Was Stuck with Busby. Yes, here he was, stuck with Busby, a fate no living creature deserved. The Baron, aged 16, 17? Anyway, aged, felt doomed to spend his last days with this plump, abhorrent beast whom the Baron had detested almost since he had appeared on the scene at least 10 or 12 years ago. Doomed unless something happened. But what would happen? And what could the Baron make happen? The Baron racked his brain. People had said since he was a pup that his intelligence was extraordinary. The Baron took some comfort in that. It was a matter of strengthening Marion's hand, difficult for a dog to do since the Baron didn't speak, though many a times his master Eddie had told him that he did speak. That was because Eddie had understood every bark and growl and glance that the Baron ever gave. The Baron lay on a tufted polka dot cushion which lined his basket. The basket had an arched top, and even this was lined with tufted polka dots. From the next room, the Baron could hear laughter, jumbled voices, the clink of a glass or bottle now and then, and Busby's occasional ha ha ha, which in the days after Eddie's death had made the Baron's ears twitch with hostility. Now the Baron no longer reacted to Busby's guffaws. On the contrary, the Baron affected a languor and unconcern better for his nerves, and now he yawned mightily, showing yellowed lower canines. Then he settled his chin on his paws. He wanted to pee. He had gone in the noisy living room 10 minutes ago and indicated to Busby by approaching the door of the apartment that he wanted to go out. But Busby had not troubled himself, though one of the young men, the Baron was almost sure, had offered to take him downstairs. The Baron got up suddenly. He couldn't wait any longer. He could, of course, pee straight on the carpet with a damn-it-all attitude, but he still had some decency left. The Baron tried the living room again. Tonight, there was more than the usual sprinkling of women. "Ooh, the Baron." "Ah, the Baron," said Busby. "He wants to go out, Busby, for Christ's sakes. Where's his leash?" "I've just had him out," shrieked Busby, lying. "When? This morning?" A young man in thick, fuzzy tweed trousers took the Baron down in the elevator. The Baron made for the first tree at the curb and lifted a leg slightly. The young man talked to him in a friendly way and said something about Eddie. The name of his master made the Baron briefly sad, though he supposed it was nice of people, total strangers. to remember his master. They walked around the block. Near the delicatessen on Lexington Avenue, a man stopped them and in a polite tone asked a question with the Baron in it. "Yes," said the young man who held the Baron's leash. The strange man patted the Baron's head gently, and the Baron recognized his master's other name, Brockhurst, Edward Brockhurst. They went on, back towards the awning of the apartment house, towards the awful party. Then the Baron's ears picked up a tread he knew, then his nose a scent he knew. Marian. "Hello, excuse me." She was closer than the Baron had supposed, because his ears were not what they used to be, nor his eyes for that matter. She talked with the young man, and they all rode up in the elevator. The Baron's heart was pounding with pleasure. Marian smelled nice. Suddenly, the whole evening was better, even wonderful, just because Marian had turned up. His master had always loved Marian, and the Baron was well aware that Marian wanted to take him away to live with her. There was quite a change in the atmosphere when the Baron and the young man and Marian walked in. The conversation died down, and Busby walked forward with a glass of his favorite bubble in his hand, champagne. The young man undid the Baron's leash. "Good evening, Busby." Marian was speaking politely, explaining something. Some people had said hello to Marian, others were starting up their conversation again in little groups. The Baron kept his eye on Marian. Could it be possible that she was going to take him away tonight? She was talking about him, and Busby looked flustered. He motioned for Marian to come into one of the other rooms, Busby's bedroom, and the Baron followed on Marian's heels. Busby would have shut the Baron out, but Marian held the door. "Come in, Baron," Marian said. The Baron disliked this room. The bed was high, made higher still by pillows, and at the foot of it was the contraption Busby used when he had his fits of wheezing and gasping, usually at night. There were 2 chromium tanks from which a rubber pipe came out, flexible metal pipes also, and the whole thing can be wheeled up to Busby's pillows. "Friend, vacation," Marian was saying. She was pleading with Busby. The Baron heard his name 2 or 3 times, Eddie's name once, and Busby looked at the Baron with the angry, stubborn expression that the Baron knew well. Knew since years, even, when Eddie had been alive. "Well, no," Busby went on, making quite an elaborate speech. Marian began again, not in the least discouraged. Busby coughed and his face darkened a little. He repeated his "no, no." Marian dropped on her knees and looked into the Baron's eyes and talked to him. The Baron waved his cropped tail. He trembled with joy, and he could have flung his paws up on Marian's shoulders, but he didn't, because it was not the right thing to do. But his front paws kept dancing on the floor. He felt younger. The Marian began talking about Eddie, and she grew angrier. She drew herself up a little when she talked about Eddie, as if he were something to be proud of. And it was evident to the Baron that she thought, she might even be saying, that Busby wasn't worth as much. The Baron knew that his master had been someone of importance. Strangers coming to the house now and then had treated Eddie as if he were their master in a way. In those days when they had lived in another apartment and Baron had served the drinks and cooked the meals like one of the servants on the ships the Baron had traveled on or in the hotels where the Baron had stayed. Now suddenly Busby was claiming the Baron as his own dog. That was what it amounted to. Busby kept saying no in an increasingly firm voice. He wandered towards the door. Marian said something in a quietly threatening tone. The Baron wished very much that he could know exactly what she said. The Baron followed her through the living room towards the front door. He was prepared to sneak out with her, leap out leashless, and just stay with her. Marian paused to talk with the young man in the fuzzy tweed trousers who had come up to her. Busby interrupted them, waving his hands, wanting to put an end to the conversation. Marian said, "Good night, good night." The Baron squeezed out with her, loped in the hall towards the elevator. A man laughed, not Busby. "Baron, you can't, darling," said Marian. Someone caught the Baron by the collar. The Baron growled, but he knew he couldn't win. That someone would give him a warning slap if he didn't do what they wanted. Behind him, the Baron heard the awful clunk that meant the elevator door had closed, and Marian was gone. Some people groaned as the Baron crossed the living room. Others laughed as the din began again, louder and merrier than ever. The Baron made straight for his master's room, which was across the hall from Busby's. The door was closed, but the Baron could open it by the horizontal handle, providing the door wasn't locked. The Baron couldn't manage the key, which stuck out below the handle, though he had often tried. Now the door opened. Busby had perhaps been showing the room to someone tonight. The Baron went in and took a breath of the air that still smelled faintly of his master's pipe tobacco. On the big desk was his master's typewriter, now covered with a cloth of a sort of polka dot pattern, like the lining of his basket bed in the spare room. The Baron was just as happy, even happier, sleeping on the carpet here near the desk as he had often done when his master worked, but Busby, nastily, usually kept the door of his master's room locked. The Baron curled up on the carpet and put his head down, his nose almost touching a leg of his master's chair. He sighed, suddenly worn out by the emotions of the last 10 minutes. He thought of Marion, recalled happy mornings when Marion had come to visit, and his master and Busby had cooked bacon and eggs or hotcakes, and they had all gone for a walk in Central Park. The Baron had used to retrieve sticks that Marion threw into a lake there. And he remembered an especially happy cruise, sunlight on the decks with his master and Marion, pre-Busby days, when the Baron had been young and spry and handsome, popular with the passengers, pampered by the stewards who brought him whole steaks to his and Eddie's cabin. The Baron remembered walks in a white-walled town full of white houses, with smells he had never known before or since, and a boat ride with the boat tossing and spraying in his face, to an island where the streets were paved with cobblestones, where he got to know the whole island and roamed where he wished. He heard again his master's voice talking calmly to him, asking him a question. The Baron heard the ghostly click of the typewriter. Then he fell asleep. He awakened to Busby's coughing, then his strained intake of air with a wheeze. The house was quiet now. Busby was walking about in his room. The Baron got to his feet and shook himself to wake up. He went out of the room so as not to be locked in for the rest of the night, walked towards the living room, but the smell of cigarette smoke turned him back. The Baron went into the kitchen, drank some water from his bowl, sniffed at the remains of some tinned dog food, and turned away, heading for the spare room. He could have eaten something. A bit of leftover steak or a lamb chop bone would have been nice. Lately, Busby dined out a lot, didn't take the Baron with him, and Busby fed him mostly from tins. Now his master would have put a stop to that. The Baron curled up in his basket. Busby's machine was buzzing. Now and again, it made a click, click sound. Busby blew his nose, a sign he was feeling better. Busby didn't go to work. Didn't work at all in the sense that Eddie had worked several hours a day at his typewriter, in some periods every day of the week. Busby got up in the mid-morning, made tea and toast, and sat in his silk dressing gown reading the newspaper, which was still delivered every morning at the door. It would be nearly noon before Busby took the Baron out for a walk. By this time, Busby would have telephoned at least twice, and then he would go out for a long lunch perhaps, or anyway, he seldom came back before late afternoon. Busby had used to have something to do with the theater, just that the Baron didn't know, but when he and his master had met Busby, they had visited him a couple of times in the busy backstage part of a New York theater. Busby had been nicer then. The Baron could remember quite well, always ready to take him out for a walk, to brush his ears and the clump of curly black hair on the top of his head, because Busby had been proud to show him off on the street in those days. Yes, and the Baron had won a prize or two at Madison Square Garden in his prime so many years ago. Oh, happy days. His 2 silver cups and 2 or 3 medals occupied a place of honor on a bookshelf in the living room, but the maid hadn't polished them in weeks now. Eddie had shown them sometimes to people who came to the apartment, and a couple of times, laughing, Eddie had served the Baron his morning biscuits and milk in one of the cups. The Baron recalled that, at the moment, there were no biscuits in the house. Why did Busby hang on to him if he didn't really like him? The Baron suspected it was because Busby was thus able to hang on to his master, who had been a more important man which meant loved and respected by a lot more people than Busby. In the awful days during his master's illness and after his death, the person the Baron had clung to was Marion, not Busby. The Baron thought that his master wished, probably had made it clear, that he wanted the Baron to live with Marion after he died. Busby had always been jealous of the Baron, and the Baron had to admit that he had been jealous of Busby. But whether he lived with Busby or Marion, that was what the fight was about. He was no fool. Marion and Busby had been fighting ever since Eddie's death. Down on the street, a car rattled over a manhole. From Busby's room, the Baron heard wheezing inhalations. The machine was unplugged now. The Baron was thirsty, thought of getting up to drink again, then felt too tired, and merely flicked his tongue over his nose and closed his eyes. A tooth was hurting. Old age was a terrible thing. He'd had 2 wives so long ago he can scarcely remember them. He'd had many children, maybe 12, and the pictures of several of them were in the living room and one on his master's desk, the Baron with 3 of his offspring. The Baron woke up, growling, from a bad dream. He looked around, dazed in the darkness. It had happened? No, it was a dream. But it had happened, yes. Just a few days ago, Busby had awakened him from a nap, leash in hand to take him out, and the Baron, maybe ill-tempered at that moment because he'd been awakened, had growled in an ominous way, not raising his head, and Busby had slowly retreated. And later that day, again, with a leash in his hand, doubled, Busby had reminded the Baron of his bad behavior and slashed the air with the leash. The Baron had not winced, only watched Busby with a cruel contempt. So they had stared at each other, and nothing had come of it, but Busby had been the first to move. Would he be able to get anywhere by fighting? The Baron's old muscles grew tense at the thought, but he couldn't figure it out, couldn't see clearly into the future, and soon he was asleep again. In the evening of that day, the Baron was surprised by a delicious meal of raw steak cut into convenient pieces, followed by a walk during which Busby talked to him in amiable tones. Then they got into a taxi. They rode quite a distance. Could they be going to Marion's apartment? Her apartment was a long way, and the Baron remembered from the days when Eddie had been alive. But Busby never went to Marion's house. Then, when the taxi stopped and they got out, the Baron recognized the butcher shop still open that smelled of spices as well as meat. They were at Marion's building. The Baron's tail began to wag. He lifted his head higher and led Busby to the right door. Busby pushed a bell, the door buzzed, then they went in and climbed 3 flights, the Baron pulling Busby up, panting and happy. Marion opened the door. The Baron stood on his hind legs, careful not to scratch her dress with his nails. And Marion took his paws. "Hello, Baron. Hello. Hello. Come in." Marion's apartment had a high ceiling and smelled of oil paint and turpentine. There was a big comfortable sofa and big comfortable chairs, which the Baron knew he was allowed to lie on if he wished to. Now there was a strange man who stood up from a chair as they went in. Marion introduced Busby to him and they shook hands. The men talked. Marion went into the kitchen and poured a bowl of milk for the Baron and gave him a steak bone, which had been wrapped in wax paper in the refrigerator. Marion said something which the Baron took to mean, "Make yourself at home, chew the bone anywhere." The Baron chose to chew it at Marion's feet, once she had sat down in a chair. The conversation grew more heated. Busby whipped some papers out of his pocket, and now he was on his feet, his face pinker, his thin blonde curls tossing. "There is not a thing." "No, no." Busby's favorite word, no. "That is not the point," Marion said. Then the other men said something more calmly than either Marion or Busby. The Baron chewed on his bone, sparing the sore tooth. The strange man made quite a long speech, which Busby interrupted a couple of times, but Busby finally stopped talking and listened. Marion was very tense. "No? No now." That was a word the Baron knew. He looked up at Marion, whose face was a little flushed also, but nothing like Busby's. Only the other man was calm. He had papers in his hand too. What was going to happen now? The Baron associated the word now with rather important commands to himself. Busby spread his hands palm down and said, "No," and many more words. A very few minutes later, the Baron's leash was attached to his collar, and he was dragged, gently but still dragged, towards the door by Busby. The Baron braced all 4 feet when he realized what was happening. He didn't want to go. He had hardly begun to visit with Marian. The Baron looked over his shoulder and pled for her assistance. The strange man shook his head and lit a cigarette. Busby and Marian were talking to each other at the same time, almost shouting. Marian clenched her fist, but she opened one hand to pat the Baron and said something kind to him before he was out in the hall and the door shut. Busby and Baron crossed a wide street and entered a bar. Loud music, awful smells, except for a whiff of freshly broiled steak. Busby drank and twice muttered to himself. Then he yanked the Baron into a taxi, yanked him because the Baron missed his footing and sprawled in an undignified way, banging his jaw on the floor of the taxi. Busby was in the foulest of moods, and the Baron's heart was pounding with several emotions: outrage, regret he had not spent longer with Marian, hatred of Busby. The Baron glanced at the windows, both nearly closed, as if he might jump out of one of them, though Busby had the leash wrapped twice around his wrist, and the buildings on either side flashed by at great speed. Busby let out the leash a little for the benefit of the doorman, who always greeted the Baron by name. Busby was so out of breath he could hardly speak to the doorman. The Baron knew he was suffering, but had no pity for him. In the apartment, Busby at once flopped into a chair, mouth open. The Baron's leash trailed, and he walked dismally down the hall, hesitated at his master's door, then went in. He collapsed on the carpet by the chair. Back again. How brief had it been his pleasure at Marian's. He heard Busby struggling to breathe, undressing in his room now, or at least removing his jacket and whipping off his tie. The Baron heard the machine being plugged in. Bzzz, click, click, the groan of a chair. Busby was doubtless in the chair by his bed, holding the mask over his face. Thirsty, the Baron got up to go to the kitchen. His leash, the hand loop part of it, caught under the door and checked him. The Baron patiently entered the room again, pulled the leash out, and went out with his shoulder near the right door jamb so the same accident wouldn't happen again. It reminded him of nasty tricks Busby had used to play when the Baron had been younger. Of course, the Baron had played a few tricks too, tripping Busby adroitly while he, the Baron, had been ostensibly only cavorting after a ball. Now the Baron was so tired, his hind legs ached, and he limped. Several teeth were hurting. He had chewed too enthusiastically on the bone. The Baron drank all his bowl. It was only half full and stale. Then on leaving the kitchen, the Baron caught his leash in the same manner under the kitchen door. Busby just then lurched out of his room, coughing, heading for the bathroom, and stepped hard on the Baron's foot. The Baron gave an agonized cry because it had really hurt, nearly broken his toes. Busby kicked at him and cursed. The Baron, as if a mysterious spring had been released, leapt and sank his teeth through Busby's trousers into his lower leg. Busby screamed and swatted the Baron on the head with his fists. This made the Baron turn loose, and Busby kicked at him again, missing. Busby was gasping. The Baron watched Busby go into the bathroom, knowing he was going to get a wet towel for his face. The Baron was suddenly full of energy. Where had it come from? He stood with 4 legs apart, his aching teeth bared, trapped by his leash, which was stuck under the kitchen door. When Busby emerged with a dripping towel clamped against his forehead, the Baron growled his deepest. Busby stumbled past him into the room, and the Baron heard him flop on the bed. Then the Baron went back into the kitchen slowly, so as not to make his leash predicament worse. The leather was tightly wedged this time, and there was not enough space if the Baron moved toward the sink to tug it out. The Baron caught the leash in his back teeth and pulled. The leash slipped through his teeth. He tried the other side of his jaw and with one yank freed the leash. This was the worst side of his jaw, and the pain was awful. Baron cringed on the floor, eyes shut for a moment, as he would never have cringed before Busby or anyone else. But pain was pain, terrible. The Baron's very ears seemed to ring with his agony, but he didn't whine. He was remembering a similar pain inflicted by Busby, or was that true? At any rate, the pain reminded him of Busby. As the pain subsided, the Baron stood up, on guard against Busby, who might come to life at any moment. The Baron carefully walked towards the living room, dragging his leash straight behind him, then turned so that he was facing the hall. He sank down and put his chin on his paws and waited, listening, his eyes wide open. Busby coughed, the kind of cough that meant the mask was off and he was feeling better. Busby was getting up. He was going to come into the living room for some champagne, probably. The Baron's hind legs grew tense, and he really might have moved out of the way, if not for a fear in the back of his mind that his leash would catch on something again. Busby approached coughing, pushing himself straight with a hand against a wall. Busby made a menacing gesture with his other hand and ordered the Baron to get out of the way. The Baron expected a foot in the face, and without thinking, hurled himself at Busby's waistline and bit. Busby came down with a fist on the Baron's spine. They struggled on the floor, Busby hitting and missing most of his blows, the Baron snapping and missing also. But the Baron was still on the living room side, and Busby retreated toward his room, the Baron after him. Busby grabbed a vase and hit the Baron on the top of the head. The Baron's sight was knocked out, and he saw only silvery lights for a few seconds. As soon as his vision came back a little, he leapt for Busby's, whose legs now dangled over the side of the bed. The Baron fell short, and his teeth clamped the rubber tube, not Busby's leg. The Baron bit and shook his head. The tube seemed as much Busby and Busby's own flesh. Busby loved that tube, depended on it, and the thick rubber was yielding slowly, just like flesh. Busby, with the mask over his face, kicked at the Baron, missing. Then the tube broke in two, and the Baron slid to the floor. Busby groped for the other end of the tube, starting to put it in his mouth, but the end was frayed and full of holes. Busby gave it up and lay back on the bed, panting like a dog himself. Blood was trickling through the hair above the Baron's eyes. The Baron staggered towards the door and turned, his tongue hanging out, his heartbeats shaking his body. The Baron lay down on the floor, and his eyes glazed over until he could hardly see. He couldn't see the bed and Busby's legs over the side, but the Baron kept his eyes open. The minutes passed. The Baron's breathing grew easier. He listened, and he could not hear anything. Was Busby asleep? The Baron half slept, instinctively saving every bit of strength that he had left. The Baron heard no sound from Busby, and finally the hackles on the Baron's neck told him that he was in the presence of someone dead. At dawn, the Baron withdrew from the room, and like a very old dog, head hanging, legs wobbling, made his way to the living room. He lay on his side, more tired than ever. Soon the telephone began to ring. The Baron barely lifted his head at the first ring, then paid no more attention. The telephone stopped, then rang again. This happened several times. The top of the Baron's head throbbed. The woman who cleaned the apartment twice a week arrived in the afternoon. The Baron recognized her step in the hall and rang the bell. Although she had a key, the Baron knew. At the same time, another elevator door opened, and some steps sounded in the hall, then voices. The apartment door opened, and the maid, whose name was something like Lisa, entered with two men who were friends of Busby's. They all seemed surprised to see the Baron standing in the living room with his leash on. They were shocked by the patch of blood on the carpet, and the Baron was reminded vaguely of the first months of his life when he had made what his master called mistakes in the house. Busby, Busby, are you here? They found Busby in the next seconds. One man rushed back into the living room and picked up the telephone. This man the Baron recognized as the one who had worn fuzzy trousers and had aired him at Busby's last party. No one paid any attention to the Baron, But when the Baron went into the kitchen, he saw that Lisa had put down some food for him and filled his water bowl. The Baron drank a little. Lisa undid his leash and said something kind to him. Another man arrived, a stranger. He went into Busby's bedroom. Then he looked at the Baron, but didn't touch him. And he looked at the blood on the carpet. Then 2 men in white suits arrived. And Busby was carried out, wrapped in a blanket, on a stretcher, just as his master had been carried out, the Baron recalled. But his master had been alive. Now the Baron felt no emotion at all on seeing Busby depart in the same manner. The young man made another telephone call. The Baron heard the name Marion, and his ears pricked up. Then the man put the telephone down, and he smiled at the Baron in a funny way. It was not really a happy smile. What was the man thinking of? He put the Baron's leash on, and they went downstairs and took a taxi. Then they went into an office, which the Baron knew at once was a vet's. The vet jabbed a needle into him. When the Baron woke up, he was lying on his side on a different table, and he tried to stand up, couldn't quite, and then he threw up the bit of water he had drunk. The friend of Busby's was still with them and carried the Baron out, and they got into another taxi. The Baron revived in the breeze through the window. The Baron took more interest as the ride went on and on. Could they possibly be going to Marion's? They were! The taxi stopped. There was the butcher shop again, and there was Marion on the sidewalk outside her door. The Baron wriggled from the man's arms and fell on the sidewalk outside the cab. Silly. Embarrassing. But the Baron got on his wobbly legs again and was able to greet Marion with tail wagging, with a lick of her hand. "Oh, Baron, old Baron," she said, and the Baron knew she was saying something reassuring about the cut on his head, now bandaged. The bandage going under his chin, too. Which the Baron knew was not serious, was quite unimportant compared to the fact that he was with Marion, that he was going to stay with Marion. The Baron somehow felt sure. Marion and the man were talking, and sure enough, the man was taking his leave. He patted the Baron on the shoulder and said, "Bye-bye, Baron," but in a tone that was merely polite. After all, he was more a friend of Busby's than the Baron's. The Baron lifted his head, gave a lick of his tongue towards the man's hand, and missed. Then Marion and the Baron walked into the butcher shop. The butcher smiled and shook the Baron's paw and said something about his head. The butcher cut a steak for Marion. Marion and the Baron climbed the stairs, Marion going slowly for the Baron's sake. She opened the door into the apartment with the high ceiling, with the sharp smell of turpentine that he had come to love. The Baron ate a bit of steak and then had a sleep on one of the big sofas. He woke up and blinked his eyes. He just had a dream, a not-so-nice dream about Busby and a lot of noisy people. But he had already forgotten the dream. This was real. Marion, standing at her work table, glancing at him now because he had raised his head, but gazing back at her work, because for the moment she was thinking more about her work than about him. Like Eddie, the Baron thought. The Baron put his head down again and watched Marion. He was old, he knew, very old. People even marveled about how old he was. But he sensed that he was going to have a second life, that he even had a fair amount of time before him. The end. I really like that story, and I hope you did too. And if you'd like to read more Patricia Highsmith, you can, even though the library is closed. If you go to saskatoonlibrary.ca and check out our digital resources, you can find some Patricia Highsmith. And if you have trouble navigating that website or any of the digital resources, you can give us a call between 10 and 6 p.m. Monday to Saturday, and someone will be able to help you out. Again, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.